Nathan Holloway was a man who prided himself on control. His life had been meticulously constructed, from his sprawling empire to his perfectly tailored suits. But the night he discovered his fiancée, Charlotte, had been cheating on him with their gardener, that control shattered. Anger consumed him, but it wasn't the fiery, impulsive kind. Nathan's anger was cold, calculated, and he was already formulating a plan. As dawn painted the New York skyline in shades of gold and steel, Nathan sat at his desk, phone in hand. His assistant, Julian, answered groggily on the second ring. "Nathan, it's barely 6 in the morning," Julian mumbled. "What's going on?" Nathan leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the city that symbolized his triumphs. "Find me everything you can on Margaret Wills." There was a pause on the other end. "Maggie, the housekeeper?" Julian asked, confused. "Yes, just do it," Nathan replied firmly, leaving no room for argument. He ended the call, exhaling slowly as he tapped his fingers against the polished desk. The betrayal he had suffered wasn't going to break him. It would shape his revenge. Margaret Wills, or Maggie, had worked in his household for nearly a year. Always quiet, always invisible. Charlotte had despised her, mocking her plain looks and treating her as nothing more than a shadow in their grand estate. That was exactly what made Maggie the perfect weapon. Nathan's plan solidified as he considered the ultimate act of retaliation. Marrying Maggie wouldn't just be an insult to Charlotte. It would be a public spectacle that she couldn't ignore. By the time Julian called back an hour later, Nathan had already made up his mind. "Got what you asked for," Julian said. "There's not much to tell. She's 28, no family, grew up in the foster system. She's worked odd jobs for years, waitressing, cleaning. No criminal record, no scandals. Pretty unremarkable." "Perfect," Nathan murmured. Julian hesitated. "Nathan, what are you planning?" Nathan allowed a small, humorless smile. "You'll find out soon enough." He ended the call and grabbed his car keys. He knew where Maggie would be. She always arrived early to prep the kitchen before the rest of the staff. He found her in the pantry, stacking boxes on the shelves. Her uniform hung loosely on her frame, and her hair was pulled back in its usual unflattering bun. She barely glanced up when he entered. "Mr. Holloway," she greeted, her tone flat and wary. "I need to speak with you," he said firmly. Maggie finally turned to meet his gaze. Her brown eyes were calm, unreadable. "About what?" Nathan took a slow step forward. "I have a proposition for you." She frowned. "A proposition?" "Yes," he said, letting the weight of his words settle between them. "I want you to marry me." The box she was holding slipped from her hands, crashing to the floor. Flour exploded in a cloud of white dust, but Maggie didn't move. She just stared at him, wide-eyed. "What?" she whispered. "You heard me," Nathan replied, crossing his arms. Maggie let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. "Is this some kind of joke?" "No joke," she scoffed, wiping her hands on her apron. "You, Nathan Holloway, want to marry me, the housemaid? Do you take me for a fool?" "I take you for someone who might be interested in changing her life," he said coolly. "I'm offering you security, wealth, a chance to never work another day in your life." Maggie narrowed her eyes. "And what do you get out of it?" Nathan smirked. "Revenge." Her expression froze. "Revenge? Charlotte humiliated me," he said, his voice icy. "She betrayed me, and I plan to return the favor." Maggie stared at him, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, to his surprise, a small, knowing smile played on her lips. "You're willing to go this far just to hurt her?" "Yes," he replied without hesitation. She exhaled, shaking her head. "That's insane." "Is it?" Nathan stepped closer. "Think about it, Maggie. You don't have family, nothing tying you down. I'm offering you a way out, a life most people only dream of." She licked her lips, glancing away. "And what happens when you get your revenge? Do you just throw me away?" "You'll be taken care of," he said simply. "I'll ensure you have everything you need." Maggie hesitated, the gears clearly turning in her mind. Then, to his shock, she smiled again, this time with a hint of something unreadable in her eyes. "Fine," she said. "I'll do it." Nathan's smirk widened. Good. 2 days later, they stood before a judge in a private courthouse. Maggie wore a simple white dress, and Nathan looked as composed as ever. The ceremony was brief, devoid of emotion, just a business transaction sealed with a few signatures. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Holloway," the judge said. Nathan barely acknowledged the words. As soon as they left the courthouse, he turned to Maggie. "Pack your things. You're moving into the penthouse." She arched an eyebrow. "You want me to live with you?" "People will be watching," he said. "If we're going to sell this, it has to be believable." Maggie shrugged. "Fine." That night, she arrived at the penthouse with a single suitcase. Nathan found himself watching her closely, unsettled by her calmness. He had expected nerves or hesitation, but Maggie carried herself with quiet confidence. As she unpacked, she turned to him. "So what's next? A public appearance? Some grand unveiling of your new wife?" Nathan smirked. "Something like that." "And Charlotte?" she asked, a sly smile playing on her lips. "She'll find out soon enough," he said. The satisfaction in his voice was evident. "When the time is right." The next morning, the press caught wind of the marriage. Headlines blared the news. Nathan Holloway, one of New York's most eligible bachelors, had secretly married his housemaid. The media frenzy was ruthless. Somewhere in the city, Charlotte Whitmore was undoubtedly losing her mind. Meanwhile, Maggie sat in front of her vanity mirror, staring at her reflection. She had spent her life in the shadows, but now she was thrust into the spotlight. She had just married one of the most powerful men in the city, and soon the entire world would know her name. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Nathan stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You're thinking too much," he said, stepping inside. Maggie crossed her arms. "Hard not to when I just signed my life away." "You signed a contract," Nathan corrected. "That's not the same as your life." Maggie scoffed. "For a year, I belong to you. I live in your world. Follow your rules. Play the part of your perfect wife. If that's not giving up my life, I don't know what is." Nathan smirked, amused by her defiance. "It's temporary, and when it's over, you'll walk away with more money than most people see in a lifetime." "Right, the fairy tale ending," she muttered. Nathan tilted his head. "You had your chance to say no." Maggie met his gaze, her fingers tightening around the edge of the vanity. "You think I could afford to say no?" He studied her carefully, unsettled by the layers he couldn't quite decipher. This wasn't a woman cowed by circumstance. She had secrets, and Nathan was beginning to suspect that he might have underestimated her. Nathan's eyes flickered with a mix of challenge and curiosity. "Why did you agree to this?" he asked, his tone low and probing. Maggie forced a tight smile, lifting her chin just enough to mask her discomfort. "For the money, of course. Why else?" Nathan exhaled softly, letting the silence stretch between them before replying. "Well, as long as you stick to the rules, this won't have to be difficult. We have our first public appearance tomorrow, a charity gala." Maggie raised an eyebrow, her voice laced with skepticism. "Tomorrow? Moving fast, aren't we? People will talk. We might as well control the story." Nathan replied matter-of-factly. She let out a slow breath, finally nodding. "Fine. Just tell me what I need to do." Nathan turned toward the door, but stopped before leaving. "There will be cameras, questions. Stick to the script." Maggie tilted her head. "And what's the script?" He glanced over his shoulder, his voice steady. "That we're in love." Maggie almost laughed at the absurdity, but managed to swallow it down. "Right. A match made in heaven." Nathan didn't reply, leaving the room without another word. Maggie turned back to the mirror, staring at her reflection. She saw a woman she barely recognized. For years, she had hidden in the shadows, running from her past. Now, she had willingly stepped into the most public and scrutinized position imaginable. If Nathan Holloway thought she was just a pawn in his game, he had no idea who he had married. The next morning, the city buzzed with speculation. Maggie's face was plastered on every news outlet. Headlines ranged from "Nathan Holloway marries unknown housemaid, love or scandal," to "Billionaire wed servant, A business deal or a fairy tale? Unable to stomach it, Maggie switched off the TV, only to find Julian standing at the doorway. His expression was neutral as always. "Mr. Holloway sent me to brief you," Julian said. Maggie crossed her arms, her tone dry. "Let me guess, smile. Stand next to him, and don't embarrass him?" Julian gave a small shrug. "More or less." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "And the gala? It's for the Holloway Foundation. All the city's elite will be there," Julian explained, his words carefully measured. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "including Charlotte." Maggie froze for a moment. "So, he really wants to rub it in her face." Julian's lips curved into a smirk. "What did you expect?" Maggie didn't answer, but her mind raced. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but one thing was clear. This gala would be her first test as Nathan Holloway's wife. That evening, the grand ballroom of the Holloway Hotel gleamed under the glow of crystal chandeliers. Gold accents adorned every surface, and the city's elite mingled in extravagant designer outfits. Maggie, now dressed in an elegant black gown chosen by Nathan's stylist, felt the weight of every pair of eyes on her as they entered. Nathan's hand rested lightly on the small of her back, a silent command to stay close. She forced a smile, the picture of a devoted wife, while internally wishing to disappear. It didn't take long to spot Charlotte. Draped in a crimson gown that clung perfectly to her flawless figure, she stood near the bar, exuding confidence. When her piercing blue eyes landed on them, they widened momentarily before she masked her reaction with a polished, venomous smile. "Nathan," Charlotte greeted, her tone dripping with sugar-coated sarcasm. "I must say, you've been full of surprises lately." Nathan's reply was smooth and indifferent. "Charlotte, I see you've caught the news." Charlotte let out a soft laugh, her gaze flicking to Maggie. "Oh, we all did. Quite the unexpected match, isn't it?" Recognizing the challenge, Maggie didn't hesitate. She turned to Nathan with a warm smile and leaned up to plant a delicate kiss on his jaw. "I suppose love doesn't always make sense," she murmured softly. For a fraction of a second, Nathan stiffened, but he recovered quickly, his hand tightening slightly on her waist. "No, it doesn't." Charlotte's smile faltered briefly before she masked it with another sip of her champagne. "Well," she said, her words as sharp as glass, I do hope you two will be very happy together." The gala went as Nathan had planned. Maggie played her role flawlessly, laughing, smiling, and delivering measured responses when necessary. By morning, their photos were splashed across social media, fueling endless speculation. But as Maggie watched the world dissect every detail of her performance, one thing became evident. This arrangement was far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. The wedding itself followed 3 days later in a lavish ceremony attended by New York's elite. Held in a grand hall, the guest list boasted investors, business moguls, and celebrities. The press was carefully invited to capture every moment, ensuring Nathan's narrative unfolded exactly as planned. A picture-perfect love story. Maggie stood at the entrance of the aisle, gripping her bouquet tightly. Her custom-designed ivory gown was stunning, a masterpiece of elegance, but it felt like a costume on her skin. She took a deep breath and began walking, her every step accompanied by whispered commentary from the audience. "Is this some sort of joke?" "I give it 6 months," another voice scoffed. None of it mattered. The only reaction that truly mattered was Charlotte's. She sat in the front row, draped in a deep red gown, her expression a mix of smug amusement and quiet malice. She wasn't heartbroken. She was entertained. Maggie knew exactly what Charlotte was thinking. Look at him. Look how far he's fallen. Reaching the altar, Maggie met Nathan's gaze. His expression was unreadable, but his extended hand was steady. "You look nervous," he murmured, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Maggie offered a small, practiced smile. "I just love a good audience." Nathan's lips twitched, almost betraying amusement. The ceremony unfolded in a blur of scripted vows and exchanged rings. When the officiant announced, "You may now kiss the bride," Nathan leaned in. His kiss was calculated, not too distant, not too intimate. It was perfect for the cameras. The reception was an exhausting blur of fake smiles and pleasantries. Charlotte cornered them at one point, her voice as smooth as silk. "Tell me, Nathan, did you do this to spite me? Or have you finally lost your mind?" Nathan smirked. "Maybe I just found someone better." Charlotte laughed, but her composure cracked ever so slightly. Maggie stepped in, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "Charlotte, I know this must be hard for you. After all, you threw away a diamond and expected him to chase after a pebble." Charlotte's smirk faltered, and for the first time that evening, she had no response. As the evening wore on, the game they were all playing became increasingly clear. But Maggie wasn't just a pawn. She had her own plans, and soon, the real show would begin. The severe, tight hairstyle Maggie had worn as a maid, a style meant to mask her beauty and keep her invisible, was gone. Now, her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders in soft waves, catching the light and framing her face. But Nathan's eyes weren't drawn to her hair. They landed on something he hadn't seen before: scars. Thin, delicate lines traced her left cheekbone and ran down toward her jaw. Another faint mark lingered, just above her brow. They weren't disfiguring, but they were striking, etched like quiet whispers of pain on her otherwise flawless skin. These scars told a story, one Nathan had never been allowed to hear. Maggie froze. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her back before she even turned. Slowly, reluctantly, she faced him. Nathan's chest tightened as recognition hit him like a freight train. This wasn't Margaret Wills, the unassuming maid he thought he'd married. No, this was Lillian Carter, a name that had once dominated the elite circles of New York City. He'd heard whispers about her years ago. Lillian Carter had been a rising star in the world of high fashion, her beauty poised to make her a legend. But then, suddenly, she disappeared. Not in a gradual fading from the spotlight. She vanished completely, as if someone had erased her from existence. Nathan took a step forward, his voice low and disbelieving. "Lillian?" "Maggie." For the first time since he'd met her, she didn't reply with a clever retort or a sly smirk. There was no lightness in her expression, no trace of playfulness. Instead, she stood silent, as if bracing herself for his reaction. Nathan exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. "So that's why you agreed so quickly." His tone was almost accusing. "You're not Margaret Wills. You're Lillian Carter." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she crossed her arms defensively. "You wanted a convenient wife. I wanted a new life. It worked for both of us." Nathan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "People don't just disappear from the world and end up as maids in my mansion. What happened to you?" Her gaze met his, steady but guarded. "Does it matter?" "Of course it matters," Nathan shot back, his frustration rising. "Because I don't like being blindsided." She tilted her head slightly, her tone edged with irony. "Oh, you mean like Charlotte blindsided you?" Nathan's jaw clenched at the mention of his ex-fiancée. "Don't turn this around." Her voice softened, but it carried a note of resignation. "I just don't see why my past matters. We both got what we wanted out of this deal." Nathan studied her carefully, his mind racing to connect the dots. He'd spent years perfecting the art of reading people, a skill honed in boardrooms and negotiations. Maggie, or Lillian, was a puzzle he hadn't even realized he was trying to solve. He gestured toward her face, his voice quieter but firm. "Your scars. They weren't an accident, were they?" For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, a flash of vulnerability, quickly buried. "No," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan's chest tightened. He'd known plenty of people who clawed their way to the top, stepping on anyone who stood in their way. But Lillian Carter hadn't fallen. She'd been pushed. "You didn't just want money," Nathan said slowly, piecing it together. "You wanted protection." She didn't deny it. Nathan took another step closer, his gaze locked on hers. "Who are you running from?" Her fingers curled into the fabric of her robe, her shoulders tense. "That's none of your concern." "The hell it isn't," Nathan said, his tone sharp. "You're my wife now. If someone's after you, that makes it my problem." A bitter smile ghosted across her lips. "This was never supposed to be personal, Nathan. You wanted revenge. That's all this was." Nathan ran a hand over his jaw, frustration bubbling up inside him. She was right. At first, this marriage had been nothing more than a calculated move, a way to humiliate Charlotte and regain the upper hand. But now, standing in front of Maggie, Lillian, everything felt different. "Does Charlotte know?" he asked after a moment. Maggie shook her head. "No, and I'd like to keep it that way." Nathan arched a brow. "Why?" "Because if she finds out, everyone will know," Maggie said firmly. "And whoever tried to destroy me once will come looking for me again." Nathan understood immediately. If Charlotte uncovered Maggie's true identity, she'd turn it into headline news out of spite. And Maggie wouldn't just lose her anonymity. She'd lose whatever safety she had left. Nathan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Jesus. Maggie studied him closely, her expression unreadable. "Are we going to have a problem?" Nathan looked at her for a long moment before shaking his head. "No, but things are different now." A flicker of something crossed her face. "Meaning?" Nathan's voice was quieter but carried a determined edge. "Meaning if you're in danger, I need to know from who." She hesitated, then sighed. "You're not going to drop this, are you?" "Not a chance," Nathan replied, his voice steady. She let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Fine." Maggie turned back to the vanity, opened a small drawer, and pulled out a worn envelope. She handed it to him without a word. Nathan unfolded the paper and read the short, chilling message. "If I ever see you again, you won't be so lucky next time." No signature, no return address, but the threat was unmistakable. Nathan looked up at her, his eyes darkening. "Who sent this?" Maggie shook her head. "I don't know, but I have my suspicions." Nathan folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. His mind was already working through every possible angle. Whoever had tried to erase Lillian Carter wasn't done yet. And whether Maggie liked it or not, she wasn't facing this alone anymore. The moment Maggie stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. The air felt charged, heavy with unspoken tension. She carefully set her bag down, her eyes scanning the room. Nathan was in the living room, sitting on the couch with his laptop open. A glass of whiskey sat untouched beside him. He didn't look up, but Maggie could tell immediately that he knew something she didn't want him to. Her voice was low but steady. "What did you do?" Nathan finally lifted his gaze, his sharp blue eyes piercing hers. "I did what I do best. I found the truth." Maggie's stomach twisted into knots. "Lillian Carter," he said slowly, deliberately, like testing the name on his tongue. Or should I say, the woman who was supposed to be dead? Her breath itched, but she quickly masked her reaction. "I told you to drop it." Nathan stood, his movements controlled but brimming with tension. "You didn't think I would, did you? You really thought I'd let you walk into my life, my house, my bed, and not figure out who you really are?" Maggie's jaw tightened. "I never lied to you." Nathan let out a bitter laugh. "No, but you let me believe you were some nobody housemaid, and in reality, you were one of the most sought-after faces in the world." She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "And what exactly did you find?" Nathan's expression was unreadable as he replied. "I found out that Lillian Carter's career didn't end because of an accident." Maggie's blood ran cold. He stepped closer, his voice softer, but no less intense. "Someone tried to kill you, didn't they?" Her throat tightened, but she held her ground. "And what if they did?" Nathan's jaw clenched. "Then I want to know who the hell they are." Maggie exhaled slowly. "Nathan, you don't want to get involved in this." His eyes narrowed. "Too late." She hesitated, her fists tightening at her sides. She had spent years burying this, locking it away so no one could ever use it against her. But now Nathan was standing there, demanding answers. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running. Maggie's voice softened. "Fine, you want the truth." Nathan crossed his arms. "I wouldn't have asked if I didn't." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It wasn't an accident. Someone wanted me dead, and I think they still do." Nathan's expression darkened. "Who?" Maggie hesitated, the name weighing heavily on her tongue. But before she could say it, Nathan's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen. his expression hardening as he read the message. Maggie frowned. "What is it?" Nathan lifted his gaze to hers, his voice grim. "We're not the only ones looking for you." A chill ran down her spine. The past she had fought so hard to escape was catching up to her. And this time, there was nowhere left to hide. Nathan wasted no time. Whoever was hunting Maggie wasn't just a forgotten ghost from her past. They were active, watching, waiting. And Nathan Holloway wasn't about to let someone play a game on his turf. In his private office, the glow of his laptop screen lit up his face as he scrolled through old news archives, fashion articles, and magazine covers from nearly 10 years ago. Lillian Carter. The name carried weight. It was impossible to forget. She had been everywhere, runways in Milan, billboards in Times Square, the face of luxury brands that defined wealth and prestige. She was untouchable. Until she wasn't. Nathan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw as the pieces came together. She hadn't just disappeared. She had been erased. One day she was on the cover of Vogue, and the next, she was gone. Her career had ended in a swirl of whispers, a tragic accident, a secret affair gone wrong. But the truth had never been made public. Clicking through old paparazzi photos, Nathan searched for clues. Then he found it, an image from the night that changed everything. A charity gala in Manhattan, hosted by one of the most powerful figures in fashion. Lillian had attended, looking every bit the rising star she was meant to be. But someone else was in the photo, just a few feet away from her, mid-conversation. Nathan's stomach dropped. It was Richard Holloway, his father. Nathan's fists curled as the implications hit him. His father had been at the last public event Lillian attended before she vanished. Coincidence? Nathan didn't believe in coincidences. He stared at the screen, his mind racing. If Richard had been involved in Lillian's downfall, this ran deeper than he'd ever expected. And it meant Maggie Lillian was in more danger than she realized. Maggie could feel something was off. Nathan had always been calculating, always cold. But now, there was something different in the way he watched her. It wasn't just scrutiny, it was assessment. She wasn't naive. She knew he had started digging. Nathan Holloway wasn't the kind of man to let something slip through his fingers, and she had given him every reason to be suspicious. Standing by the penthouse window, she hugged her arms around herself, staring down at the city lights below. She had been running for so long, always staying one step ahead, never letting anyone in. But now she was trapped, married to a man who was smarter than she had anticipated, bound by a deal that had started as convenience, but had quickly turned into something much more dangerous. The sound of the door opening pulled her from her thoughts. Nathan's voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it. "You're quiet." She didn't turn around. "I have a lot on my mind." Nathan stepped further into the room, his presence commanding as always. "Is that why you went to see Becky?" Maggie stiffened but kept her expression neutral as she turned to face him. "You had me followed?" Nathan's smirk was almost amused. "You expected anything less?" She shook her head. "You really don't trust me, do you?" Nathan's tone was sharp. "Would you?" Her gaze didn't waver. "No." A flicker of understanding passed between them, unspoken but undeniable. Nathan crossed his arms. "What did Becky tell you?" Maggie debated her answer before replying. "She thinks I should run." Nathan arched a brow. "And are you planning to?" She let out a short laugh. "I can't exactly disappear now, can I?" Nathan's gaze bore into hers. "No, you can't." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Nathan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "If someone is after you, we need to stay ahead of them." Maggie frowned. "We?" Nathan's voice was firm. "Yes, we." She folded her arms. "Why do you care?" Nathan stepped closer, his voice steady. "Because whether you like it or not, you're my problem now." Maggie exhaled slowly, watching him carefully. She could tell he meant it, but she also knew that if Nathan Holloway was getting involved, this was far from over. Maggie looked away, her pulse pounding in her ears, trying to make sense of the unreadable flicker in Nathan's gaze. "That's what I intend to find out," she muttered, her voice steady despite the storm brewing within her. Nathan Holloway studied her closely, catching the subtle way her fingers twitched and her jaw tightened. She was trying to stay composed, but her fear was clear to him, and that fear only confirmed his suspicions. Richard Holloway had done something to her. Nathan exhaled slowly. "Maggie, I need you to be honest with me. Do you remember anything from that night?" Maggie hesitated, her nails pressing into her palms. "I remember the gala. I remember leaving. Then nothing. I woke up in the hospital, and they told me I'd been in a car accident." Nathan's voice softened but remained careful. "And you never questioned it?" A dry laugh escaped her lips. "Of course I did, but no one listened. The moment I started asking questions, I was blacklisted. My career, my life. It was all gone overnight." Nathan's jaw tightened, anger flashing in his eyes. "That wasn't an accident. That was a cover-up." Maggie met his gaze, something fierce igniting in her eyes. "And now you're telling me your father was involved?" Nathan didn't flinch. "Yes." Silence stretched between them, heavy and tense. Maggie swallowed hard. "So what now?" Nathan ran a hand down his face, frustration evident. "Now we find out exactly what my father did and why." Maggie let out a slow breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "And if he's still watching me?" Nathan's expression hardened. "Then he'll regret it." Maggie studied him for a long moment, finally nodding. For now, she was willing to trust him. But deep down, Nathan knew this was just the beginning. If Richard Holloway had tried to erase Lillian Carter once, he wouldn't stop now. And Nathan wasn't about to let that happen again. Charlotte Whitmore prided herself on being the smartest person in any room. Years of perfecting manipulation and reading people like open books had made her formidable. She despised being underestimated. So, when news of Nathan's sudden marriage reached her, she didn't buy it for a second. Nathan Holloway wasn't impulsive, especially not in matters of the heart. Their breakup had been messy, sure, but not enough to push him into such a drastic move. Marrying his housemaid? It didn't add up. It felt calculated, deliberate. But why her? At first, Charlotte laughed at the absurdity of it all. She'd smirked at the wedding, sipping champagne as Nathan paraded his new bride in front of New York's elite. "He thinks he's punishing me," she thought. "He thinks this is revenge." But the moment Charlotte really looked at Maggie, something unsettled her. It wasn't just the way Maggie carried herself, though that had been the first clue. Maggie was too poised, too confident for someone supposedly unfamiliar with high society. She handled whispers and condescending looks with sharp, measured grace. That wasn't how a maid behaved. Charlotte didn't believe in coincidences. The more she observed Maggie, the more certain she became. This woman wasn't who she claimed to be. She needed the truth, and once she had it, she would do what she did best, destroy her. 2 days later, Charlotte sat in her penthouse, a glass of rose in hand, her manicured nails tapping against the rim as she stared at the files spread out before her. She had pulled the right strings, paid the right people, and the results didn't disappoint. Margaret Wills didn't exist. There were no birth records, no social security trace, no history beyond what Nathan's staff had provided. It was as if she had been conjured out of thin air. Then came the photograph. The moment Charlotte saw it, her heart stopped. The image staring back at her was Lillian Carter. It had been years since the supermodel's face graced magazine covers, but Charlotte's sharp eye caught it immediately. The bone structure, the posture, it was her. Older, altered slightly by time and scars, but unmistakably Lillian Carter. Excitement buzzed through Charlotte. This wasn't just some maid playing dress-up. This was a scandal waiting to erupt, and she was going to light the match. She reached for her phone, dialing a number. "Hello," a smooth voice answered. "James," Charlotte purred, a smirk forming. "I need a favor." James Harper, one of the city's most notorious gossip columnists, owed her. She leaned back, crossing her legs. "How much do you know about Nathan's new wife?" There was a pause before James chuckled. "Everyone's talking about her, but no one knows much." Charlotte's smirk deepened. "That's about to change. I have a name for you. Trust me, James, this one will break the internet." Nathan sat in his office, documents scattered before him. His father's involvement in Lillian's past haunted him, each revelation raising more questions than answers. But one thought persisted. Whoever had tried to erase Lillian Carter wasn't done yet. His phone buzzed. Julian's name flashed on the screen. Nathan answered. "What is it?" "You need to turn on the news." Nathan frowned, grabbing the remote. As the broadcast filled the screen, his blood ran cold. Exclusive reports scrolled across the bottom, accompanied by side-by-side images of Maggie and Lillian Carter. The anchor's voice echoed through the room. "Shocking news today as sources reveal that Nathan Holloway's wife, previously identified as Margaret Wills, may actually be former supermodel Lillian Carter, presumed dead after a mysterious accident years ago. New evidence raises questions about her disappearance and whether her marriage to Holloway is part of a larger cover-up." Nathan's grip tightened on the remote. Charlotte. He didn't need to think twice. She had done this. She had exposed Maggie. His heart raced. This wasn't about humiliation anymore. This was dangerous. If Maggie had been hiding, there was a reason. If someone had tried to kill her before, they'd come after her again. Grabbing his phone, Nathan dialed Maggie. No answer. His chest tightened. Where the hell was she? Without hesitation, he grabbed his jacket and stormed out. Charlotte Whitmore was stunning, radiating the effortless charm that once made her the most envied woman in Nathan's life. Tonight, she played her part flawlessly. "Well, well," Charlotte's voice carried across the room, sweet yet dripping with venom. "If it isn't the couple of the hour." Conversations around them halted. All eyes turned to the pair as Charlotte seized the spotlight. Maggie managed a polite smile. "Charlotte." Charlotte's gaze flicked between Maggie and Nathan, amusement sparking in her eyes. "I have to say, Nathan, I was stunned when I saw the news. What an interesting choice for a wife." Maggie's fingers twitched, but she kept her expression calm. She wouldn't give Charlotte the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. Nathan's hand tightened around her waist. His voice was firm but restrained. "Charlotte, if you're here to cause a scene, don't waste your time." Charlotte let out a light laugh, feigning innocence. "Oh, Nathan, I would never. I just think transparency is so important, especially at an event like this. After all, people trust their donations will go to good causes." The crowd murmured, tension building in the air. Charlotte's focus shifted fully to Maggie, her smile sharpening. "Tell me, darling, should I call you Maggie? Or would you prefer Lillian?" The room fell silent. Maggie felt the weight of every stare, the buzz of whispers growing louder. "She's really Lillian Carter? Didn't she die years ago? What's she doing here?" Maggie stood frozen but refused to flinch. She wouldn't give Charlotte the reaction she wanted. But Charlotte wasn't done yet. "I must admit," Charlotte continued, her voice syrupy, "I feel a little deceived. We all thought Nathan had married a simple, ordinary woman, but instead, he's chosen someone with such a remarkable past. A past that, if I'm not mistaken, ended with a tragic accident and your supposed death." Gasps rippled through the ballroom. Maggie could feel the stares intensify. The whispers were a storm now, rising with judgment and curiosity. "This is scandalous. Did Nathan know? Or was he fooled like the rest of us?" Charlotte's smirk deepened as she turned to Nathan. Her voice was a purr, dripping with mock sympathy. "Tell me, Nathan, how long have you known?" Maggie glanced up at Nathan, expecting him to shut Charlotte down with his usual sharp authority. But he hesitated. It was only a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but long enough for everyone to see. Maggie's heart sank. Charlotte's grin widened. "Oh, darling," she said triumphantly. "He didn't know, did he?" The crowd erupted into murmurs, the tension in the room crackling like electricity. Maggie realized, in that moment, she was on her own. Her pulse pounded in her ears, but she forced herself to stay composed. She wouldn't let Charlotte win. Taking a slow, deliberate breath, Maggie finally spoke. Her voice was calm and steady. "Since when does Charlotte Whitmore care about honesty?" The room stilled. A few nervous chuckles escaped from the crowd. Charlotte raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Deflection? How original," she said smoothly. Maggie tilted her head slightly. "Tell me, Charlotte, what exactly bothers you more? The fact that I exist, or that Nathan didn't need you to move on?" The atmosphere shifted. Charlotte's smile faltered, just for a moment. Maggie stepped forward, meeting her gaze head on. "You're right about one thing. I do have a past, a complicated one, but I never pretended to be perfect. She turned, addressing the crowd now. Tell me, who here doesn't have secrets? The room grew quiet. The tension eased just slightly, as whispers died down. These people thrived on scandals, drawn to chaos like moths to a flame. Charlotte had handed them a new obsession, but Maggie had turned the tide. Letting out a soft, almost amused laugh, Maggie finished. So go ahead. Whisper, speculate, write your headlines. But if you think you can break me, Charlotte... She locked eyes with her rival one last time. You'll have to try harder. Without waiting for a response, Maggie turned and walked away. The room buzzed with renewed energy, but she didn't look back. She didn't need to. The game had shifted in her favor. As soon as she stepped outside, out of sight from the crowd, she let herself breathe. That's when Nathan caught up to her. Maggie, he said urgently. She turned sharply, her eyes blazing. Don't. He stopped, jaw tightening. Let me explain. Her pulse thundered in her ears. You hesitated, Nathan. I was blindsided, he said, frustration lacing his voice. And so was I, she snapped, stepping closer. But I didn't hesitate. Nathan's face darkened. I never said I didn't believe in you. You didn't have to, she whispered, her voice raw. Because in there, you left me alone. Nathan clenched his fists, his expression hardening. I'll fix this. Maggie swallowed, forcing herself to stay composed. She wanted to believe him, to trust him, but trust had never come easily for her. And tonight, she had been reminded why. In their world, hesitation could cost everything. Nathan had something his father never expected, a reason to fight, and that reason was Maggie. But as he prepared to take on Richard, another betrayal was already in motion, one neither of them saw coming. It started with a phone call. Maggie hadn't had time to recover from the chaos of the gala. The exposure, the whispers, and Nathan's hesitation had left her shaken, though she refused to admit it. Years of building walls and learning to vanish when the world turned against her had made her resilient. But this time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. Her phone buzzed on the marble countertop. She hesitated at the sight of the number, Becky. Becky had always been her closest ally, the only person who knew the truth before anyone else. But something about this call felt off. Still, she answered. Becky, there was no greeting, just urgency. Maggie, you need to listen to me carefully. Maggie frowned. What's wrong? You're not safe, Becky said, her voice sharp. Richard knows who you are. He's making moves to get rid of you. Again, Maggie's breath hitched. She had always known Richard Holloway was dangerous, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill through her. You're sure? She asked, keeping her voice steady even as her fingers tightened around the phone. He's putting out feelers, Becky said. Money is changing hands. Quiet arrangements. He's setting you up for something, Maggie. If you don't leave now, you won't get another chance. Maggie's heart raced. She had spent years hiding, reinventing herself, escaping. And now, it was happening all over again. Only this time, she wasn't alone. Her eyes drifted toward the hallway, where she knew Nathan was in his office, likely plotting against the same man who was now targeting her. Becky's voice softened. Maggie, I know what you're thinking, but you can't trust him. Maggie swallowed hard. It's not that simple. It is, Becky snapped. Nathan is still part of that world. He will always choose himself over you. Maggie wanted to argue, to tell Becky that Nathan was different, that he had his own battles to fight, his own reasons for standing against his father. But deep down, she knew Becky wasn't entirely wrong. Nathan had hesitated when she needed him most. And if he hesitated again, what then? Maggie. Becky's voice softened, urgent but pleading. Don't wait for him to save you. Run now. Maggie closed her eyes. She already knew what she had to do. She'd survived before, and she could do it again, even if it meant leaving everything behind. Nathan had just finished an unpleasant phone call when he noticed something was off. The penthouse was too quiet. He stepped into the living room, scanning the space. Maggie's bag was gone. So was her coat. His stomach dropped. He moved quickly, checking the bedrooms, the balcony, even the kitchen. Nothing. She was gone. Nathan clenched his jaw. She was running. The realization hit him like a punch to the ribs. She didn't trust him, not enough to stay. "Damn it, Maggie," he muttered under his breath, already reaching for his car keys. If she thought he'd let her disappear, she was dead wrong. Maggie moved fast. Her duffel bag was slung over her shoulder, her footsteps quick but deliberate as she weaved through Manhattan's crowded streets. No taxis, no credit cards, no obvious routes. She'd done this before. She could do it again. Her destination was Penn Station. It was always easy to vanish there. Cash purchases, trains heading in every direction, no paper trail. She was 4 blocks away when she heard it. The slam of a car door. Maggie. Her blood froze. She knew that voice. Turning slowly, heart pounding, she saw him. Nathan stood just a few feet away, breathing hard, his blue eyes burning with something raw. She didn't wait. She turned and ran. She barely made it a few steps before his hand closed around her wrist. "Let go," she hissed, struggling. Nathan didn't. His grip was firm but not painful, unyielding. "Maggie," he said, his voice low. "You are not running from me." Her heart hammered. "I don't have a choice, Nathan." "The hell you don't," he snapped. She yanked her arm away, taking a step back, breathing fast. "Richard is coming for me," she said through clenched teeth. "I can't. I won't let him get another shot." Nathan stepped closer. "And you think leaving makes you safer?" His voice was sharp, but there was something else there, something desperate. Maggie swallowed hard. "I've survived before. I can do it again." Nathan let out a low, bitter laugh. "And what?" he challenged. "Spend the rest of your life running?" Maggie stiffened. Nathan's eyes softened, just slightly. "You said no one ever fought for you," he murmured. "Let me." Her throat tightened. He meant it. But trust? Trust was dangerous. Nathan studied her, then sighed. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled something out, and held it up. Her passport. Maggie's stomach twisted. Nathan tilted his head. "You were going to need this, weren't you?" She didn't answer. Nathan exhaled sharply, his jaw tight. "Come home, Maggie." Maggie stared at him. For the first time in years, she hesitated. Nathan barely breathed as he waited. If she ran, he wouldn't chase her. If she left now, she wouldn't come back. Maggie swallowed, her fingers twitching. Then, finally, she stepped forward. Nathan didn't say anything. He just offered his hand. Maggie hesitated one last time. Then slowly, she took it. For now, that was enough. Nathan barely slept that night. Even after bringing Maggie back to the penthouse, even after ensuring she wouldn't run again. At least, not yet. His mind raced. He knew Richard. His father never made empty threats. The moment Maggie had chosen to stay, she'd painted a target on her back. So, when Nathan's phone buzzed the next morning with a message from an unknown number, he knew exactly who it was before even reading it. "Meet me. Noon. Private club. Alone. No name. No further instructions." But there was only one man who could send a message like that. Nathan exhaled slowly, gripping the phone tightly before setting it down. It was time. The private club was the kind of place where deals were whispered, fortunes changed hands over a single glass of whiskey, and power was the only currency that mattered. Nathan had been coming here with his father since he was 22. Richard had taught him that this was where control was solidified. But today, as Nathan stepped inside, he wasn't just another Holloway heir. He was walking into enemy territory. Richard was already seated near the window, a drink in front of him. His posture was relaxed, unshaken, as if this was just a casual meeting between father and son. Nathan slid into the seat across from him, keeping his expression unreadable. Richard barely glanced up. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come." Nathan let out a slow, humorless chuckle. "Oh, please. We both know I never had a choice." Richard smirked faintly. "At least you understand that much." Nathan leaned forward. "Enough games, Richard. What do you want?" Richard took a sip of his drink, then set it down with deliberate ease. He met Nathan's gaze, his voice calm but cutting. "I want you to fix your mistake." Nathan's jaw clenched. "You mean Maggie?" Richard didn't blink. I mean the mess you've created, the embarrassment, the weakness, the liability. He tilted his head slightly. But yes, I mean the girl. Nathan's fingers curled into fists under the table. She's not just a girl. Richard studied him carefully. You're serious about her then? Nathan exhaled sharply. I didn't plan on being. Richard sighed, as if disappointed. You were always the smart one, Nathan. Ruthless, calculated. I respected that about you. He leaned back, his expression darkening. But this is emotion. This is weakness. Nathan's pulse pounded, but he forced himself to stay still. Richard shook his head. You don't get to be weak in this world, Nathan. And you don't get to be sentimental. Not if you want to survive. Nathan let out a low laugh, though there was no humor in it. Right, because survival is all that matters to you. Richard's lips curled slightly. Survival is the only thing that matters. Nathan met his gaze. Then let me ask you something, Richard. If survival is everything, if control is everything, why were you at that gala the night Lillian Carter was erased? Richard's fingers stilled against his glass. It was only a fraction of a second, but Nathan saw it. Richard set his drink down with a quiet clink. Careful, son. Nathan's voice hardened. What did you do to her? Richard exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the table. That's not the question you should be asking. Nathan's jaw tightened. Then what is? Richard leaned forward, his eyes cold and calculating. The question, Nathan, is how much are you willing to lose? Silence stretched between them. Then Richard pulled out a small envelope and slid it across the table. Nathan hesitated before picking it up. He opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. His stomach dropped. Inside were documents, legal papers, financial statements, contracts. Everything was falling apart. His stake in the Holloway Empire, his voting power, his control. Richard had already moved against him. Richard's voice was quiet but sharp. If you walk away from her now, I'll let you keep what's yours. I'll restore your standing. You'll be my son again. Nathan felt his pulse pounding in his ears. And if I don't? He asked, his voice dangerously calm. Richard's smirk was slow, deliberate. Then you lose everything. Nathan exhaled, looking down at the papers again. His entire life had been shaped by the Holloway name. He had fought, clawed his way to the top under his father's rule, believing that one day he could outgrow the shadow Richard had cast over him. But now he saw the truth. Richard had never been a mentor. He had never been a father. He had been a master, and Nathan nothing more than a piece on his board. And now Richard expected him to fold. Nathan inhaled slowly. Then Nathan leaned back, tossing the envelope onto the table with a casual defiance. You really think I'd sell her out that easily? Richard didn't flinch. I think you don't fully understand the consequences yet. Nathan chuckled darkly, his voice low but firm. No, Richard, you don't. Richard raised an eyebrow, intrigued but unfazed. Nathan tilted his head slightly, his gaze cold. Here's the thing about threats. They only work if the person you're threatening is afraid of losing something. A faint smirk crossed Richard's face. And you're not afraid? Nathan's voice was steady and unshaken. No, he said quietly, because I have nothing left to lose. For the first time, hesitation flickered in Richard's eyes. Nathan wasn't playing by his rules anymore, and that shifted the dynamic. Richard exhaled sharply, standing up with an air of finality. I'll give you a few days to reconsider. Nathan didn't move from his seat. Don't bother. Richard studied him, his gaze calculating, but Nathan didn't waver. After a long moment, Richard turned and walked away without another word. Nathan sat there for a moment, his thoughts clearing like a storm finally breaking. His pulse steadied as a newfound clarity settled over him. For years, he had lived under Richard's control, a pawn in his father's game. But that ended now. He pulled out his phone and dialed. Maggie answered on the second ring, her voice cautious. Nathan. Pack a bag, he said firmly. She hesitated, her voice wary. Why? What's going on? Nathan's tone was resolute. Because my father just declared war. Maggie exhaled audibly. And what exactly are we going to do about it? Nathan's lips curled into a small, confident smirk. "We're going to win." Maggie held her phone tightly, her knuckles white as her mind raced. Nathan had sounded so sure, like victory was already theirs. But Maggie knew better. Power wasn't about declarations, it was about actions. And trust. That was a luxury she had learned to live without. Her voice softened, tinged with doubt. "Nathan." Something in her tone must have tipped him off because his voice changed, low and insistent. "I need you to trust me." Maggie let out a bitter laugh. "You say that like it's easy." "It should be," he countered. "I brought you back. I didn't let you run." "That's not the same as trust," she said quietly. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken tension. Maggie could feel him waiting, hoping she would reassure him, align herself with his plans. But she wasn't sure they were even on the same side. Nathan had his reasons for fighting Richard, his own agenda. Maggie? She was fighting for herself. She took a breath, her resolve hardening. "I need to do this my way." Nathan's voice tightened. "What does that mean?" "It means I don't need a knight in shining armor, Nathan. I never have." Another pause, longer this time. Then Nathan said, his voice firm, "You're not running again." "No," she admitted, "but I'm not standing still either." Before he could respond, she hung up. Maggie couldn't afford to wait for someone else to save her. She'd been fighting for her life long before Nathan stepped into it, and she wasn't about to stop now. Maggie moved quickly, her steps purposeful as she slipped through the city streets. Old habits kicked in. She needed leverage, real leverage, against Richard Holloway, and she knew exactly where to find it. Richard's empire wasn't built on clean deals and fair practices. Men like him didn't rise to power without skeletons buried deep, and Maggie was ready to dig them up. She pulled out her phone, dialing a number she hadn't called in years. The voice on the other end was light, almost amused. "Thought you'd never call." "I need something," Maggie said, skipping any pleasantries. There was a pause then. "Of course you do." "I'm serious, Becky," Maggie snapped. "Richard Holloway. I need everything on him." A low whistle came through the line. "Going straight for the jugular, huh? I don't have time to play nice." Becky was quiet for a beat, then said, "Meet me in an hour." Maggie nodded. "Text me the location." She hung up and grabbed her coat. Time was running out. Nathan stared at his phone long after the call ended, his grip tightening. Maggie was hiding something, and he didn't like it. She wasn't running, but she wasn't exactly staying put either. She was acting on her own, and Nathan knew that was dangerous. He had spent years navigating the Holloway world, and he knew how ruthless Richard could be. If Maggie thought she could take him on alone, she was making a deadly mistake. Nathan dialed Becky's number. She answered quickly, her tone teasing. "Nathan Holloway. Didn't expect to hear from you." "Where is she?" Nathan demanded, skipping any formalities. Becky laughed softly. "And why would I tell you that?" Nathan's patience was razor thin. "Because if she goes after Richard alone, he'll destroy her. And I won't let that happen." There was a pause, then Becky sighed. "West 43rd Street. Old office building." Nathan didn't wait for anything else. He was already moving. Maggie stepped into the dimly lit office, her heart steady but her senses sharp. Becky was already there, sitting casually in a worn leather chair, a laptop open in front of her. "Hope you know what you're doing," Becky said, not looking up. Maggie exhaled, her voice steady. "I need something that can bring Richard down." Becky gestured to the screen. "Lucky for you, I found something. And trust me, it's big." Maggie stepped closer, her eyes scanning the files on the laptop. Financial records, offshore accounts. Her stomach tightened. "How did you get this?" she whispered. Becky smirked. "You're not the only one who knows how to dig." Maggie clicked through the files, her heart racing. This wasn't just corruption, it was criminal. Richard had been laundering money through shell companies for years, and now Maggie had the proof. "This is enough," she murmured. "This is enough to destroy him." Becky watched her carefully. "You sure about this?" Maggie nodded. "I'm done running." She reached for a flash drive to copy the files when the door slammed open. Maggie froze, her breath catching in her throat. Nathan stood there, his expression dark and stormy, his blue eyes blazing as they took in the scene. The laptop, the files, the flash drive in Maggie's hand. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Maggie's heart twisted. She had known he would come, but she hadn't expected him to look so betrayed. "I told you," she said quietly. "I needed to do this my way." Nathan stepped forward, his tone icy. "And what, Maggie? You think you can take on Richard alone?" Nathan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Damn it, Maggie. This isn't just about you anymore." She froze, her eyes narrowing slightly. Nathan's voice dropped lower, rougher. "If you go after him like this, he will come for you, and I won't let that happen." Maggie swallowed hard. "Then don't try to stop me." Nathan shook his head slowly, frustration etched into his features. "That's not what I meant." Maggie's pulse quickened, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Then what do you mean?" Nathan took another step closer, his gaze steady. "I mean," he said quietly, "we do this together." Maggie stared at him, his words lingering in the air like an unspoken promise. "We do this together." She wanted to believe him, to let herself hope, but trust? That was a risk she wasn't sure she could afford anymore. She exhaled, her fingers curling tightly around the flash drive in her palm. "You said you wanted to take Richard down," she murmured. "Then let me do what I do best." Nathan's jaw tightened. Maggie, but she was already moving, slipping past him with determination in her stride. Her decision was made. She wasn't going to sit back and wait for Nathan to make the next move. This was her fight, and it was time she ended it herself. Richard Holloway's headquarters was a fortress, glass walls, steel foundations, the kind of corporate power that screamed untouchable. But no empire was invincible, and Maggie knew exactly where to strike. She had spent the past 24 hours gathering information, mapping out every detail of her plan. She had one shot to do this right, to find the evidence she needed and expose Richard for who he really was. As she stepped into the towering building, her posture was straight, her expression unreadable. She wasn't sneaking in through back doors or creeping in shadows. No, she walked confidently through the front entrance, dressed in a sleek black suit with her hair pinned back. Confidence was her ultimate disguise. No one questioned her as she strolled through the lobby. No one hesitated when she flashed a badge she had borrowed from a careless assistant that morning. The elevator door slid shut as she pressed the button for the top floor, Richard's private office. If there was any proof he had sabotaged her career, it would be there. Taking a slow, steady breath, Maggie calmed herself. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. The office was dark when she stepped inside, the city lights casting long shadows across the polished floors. Richard's imposing desk stood at the far end of the room, a symbol of his unchecked power. Maggie moved quickly, her fingers gliding over the smooth surface until she found the computer. Plugging in her flash drive, her heart pounded as she began her search. Files upon files, contracts, transactions, so many secrets buried under layers of corporate influence. But Maggie wasn't looking for just any secret. She wanted the one that had destroyed her life. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, scanning through old records and archived messages. And then she found it, a folder labeled Project Carter. Maggie's breath caught as she clicked it open. Emails between Richard and a major modeling agency. Confidential reports. Blacklisted contracts. And there it was, a direct order from Richard Holloway himself. Ensure Lillian Carter never works again. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the messages. He had done it. He had pulled the strings. All those years when she thought her life had unraveled by chance, she had believed she was forgotten. But it was him. Richard had erased her. And as if that wasn't enough, he had tried to kill her. Maggie clenched her jaw, blinking back the sting in her eyes. No more. She copied every file, transferring them to her flash drive. This was the proof she needed. It was time to expose Richard for everything he had done. She was about to pull the flash drive from the computer when she heard the click of the office door. The lights flashed on. Standing in the doorway was Richard Holloway. Nathan's gut told him something was wrong the moment he stepped into the penthouse and found it empty. Maggie was gone. His pulse pounded as he pulled out his phone and dialed the only person who might know where she was. Becky picked up instantly. "She's at Holloway Enterprises," she said, not waiting for him to ask. Nathan's breath hitched. No, she wouldn't. Except, of course, she would. Maggie wasn't waiting for anyone to save her. She was walking straight into the fire. Nathan didn't waste another second. Grabbing his keys, he ran. Maggie didn't flinch. She met Richard's gaze head on, her heart pounding but her expression unreadable. "Should I be impressed?" he mused, stepping further into the room. "Or should I be disappointed that you thought you could outplay me?" Maggie exhaled slowly. "You erased my life," she murmured. "Now I'm returning the favor." Richard chuckled, shaking his head as if amused. "Oh, Maggie," he sighed. "You still think this is about you, don't you?" Her grip tightened on the flash drive. "It was never about you," Richard continued, his tone calm. "You were just a loose end, an inconvenience. You were supposed to stay buried." Maggie's pulse raced. She refused to let him intimidate her. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to send everything to every major news outlet in the country. Before she could, Richard lunged. His hand slammed onto the desk, grabbing her wrist and twisting it just enough to make her flinch. Maggie's breath hitched, but she kept her gaze steady. "Do you know what happens to people who cross me?" Richard murmured, his voice quiet and menacing. "They don't get second chances." Rage simmered beneath her skin. She wouldn't let him win. Then, a new voice cut through the tension. "Let her go." Both of them turned. Standing in the doorway was Nathan, his expression unreadable, his blue eyes locked onto Richard. Maggie's breath caught. Nathan had come. Richard straightened, his hand slipping from Maggie's wrist as he let out a quiet sigh. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Nathan stepped further into the office, his tone cold. "You should be worried that I did." Richard smirked. "You think you can stop this?" Nathan didn't blink. "I don't think," he said. "I know." Silence stretched between them. Then Maggie moved. Fast. She grabbed the flash drive and hit send. Emails, documents, everything was launched into the world. Richard lunged, but Nathan was already there, stepping between them and stopping him. It was over. Maggie met Richard's gaze, her breath uneven. "You don't owe me anymore," she whispered. Richard's jaw tightened, and for the first time, he looked afraid. The email was out. The files were sent. There was no undoing it. G gripped the flash drive tightly, meeting his gaze. "I don't need." Maggie watched Richard's face crack, his usual composed demeanor gone. His jaw tightened, his nostrils flared, and for the first time, she saw something in him she never thought possible: panic. "You stupid girl," Richard hissed, his voice low and venomous. "Do you even realize what you've done?" Maggie didn't flinch. She stood firm, staring him down. "Yeah," she murmured. "I ended you." Nathan stood between them, his presence unshakable, his piercing blue eyes locked onto his father. Richard had spent his life manipulating, destroying, and erasing others, but now Nathan watched him face the consequences for the first time. Suddenly, a series of buzzing sounds filled the room. Richard's phone screen lit up with dozens of notifications. Maggie knew the storm had begun. The first leaks had hit the media. Emails between Richard and corporate heads, financial records proving money laundering, contracts that blacklisted Maggie from the industry, and secret deals covering up scandals. But one revelation towered above the rest. A wire transfer to Victor Langley, the head of the security firm involved the night of Maggie's accident. The same Victor Langley who had disappeared when everyone believed Maggie was dead. Nathan's pulse raced as the realization sank in. Maggie had been right all along. Richard hadn't just sabotaged her career. He had tried to kill her. And now the whole world knew it. Nathan exhaled, watching his father's phone continue to light up. Names popped up, former allies, now calling to cut ties. Nathan let out a dark laugh. "Looks like your friends are jumping ship." Richard's hand gripped his phone tightly, his knuckles turning white. "You think this will stop me?" he growled, his voice dangerously low. Nathan tilted his head slightly. I don't think. I know. Richard exhaled slowly, and the panic in his eyes vanished, replaced by cold calculation. You still don't get it, he said, his voice smooth and controlled again. In this world, there's always a way back. New alliances, new deals, a higher bid. Nathan shook his head, undeterred. Not this time. Richard's lips curled into a faint smirk. Why? Nathan's gaze darkened. Because you're alone now. As if on cue, Richard's phone buzzed again. But this time, it wasn't a former ally. It was his legal team. His empire was crumbling, lawsuit by lawsuit. By the time Maggie and Nathan exited Holloway Enterprises, the media frenzy had reached a fever pitch. Reporters swarmed them outside, cameras flashing and microphones thrust in their faces. Mr. Holloway, is it true your father was behind Lillian Carter's disappearance? Maggie, how long have you known about the cover-up? Nathan shook his head, stepping back, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. You're scared. She let out a soft, bitter laugh. You think I'm scared of running? No, Nathan said, his tone softer now. You're scared of staying. Maggie froze. Her eyes flickered with something unspoken, but she didn't move. Nathan took a deep breath, his voice steady. You don't know how to let someone love you, do you? Her throat tightened, and she whispered, Nathan, you've spent your whole life looking over your shoulder, he continued, his words striking like a truth she couldn't deny. Waiting for the moment someone betrays you. But I'm not Richard. I'm not Charlotte. I'm not the people who destroyed you. Maggie swallowed, her pulse racing. She wanted to believe him, but the walls she had built around herself were unyielding. Nathan stepped closer, his voice dropping to a gentle plea. I love you, Maggie, and I know you feel something too. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, her defenses faltered. But then, just as quickly, she pulled back. Her expression hardened, and she shook her head. I can't, she whispered. Nathan's chest ached. Can't or won't. Her jaw clenched, and she said quietly, Does it matter? Nathan exhaled slowly, the fire in him dimming, replaced by something heavier defeat. He watched as Maggie grabbed her bag, her voice steady but distant. Take care of yourself, Holloway. This time, Nathan didn't stop her. He stood in silence as she walked out of his life, leaving him alone in the quiet of the room. The city was alive around Maggie, taxis honking, neon signs flashing against the night sky. She moved through the streets, blending into the crowd, disappearing into the chaos of New York. She had done it. She had survived. Richard was finished. The truth was out. She had won. But as she walked, her chest felt hollow, like she had left a piece of herself behind. Memories of Nathan flooded her mind, his voice, his touch, the way he looked at her, like she was the only thing that mattered. She had walked away from that because she had to. It was the only way she knew how to survive. But now, as she pushed forward into the bustling city, it didn't feel like victory. For the first time, it felt like a mistake. Nathan tried to move on. Days turned into weeks, but nothing felt the same. The world around him had changed. Richard was gone, his empire in ruins, his name disgraced. Nathan had been handed everything he thought he wanted. The company, the power, the control. But none of it mattered. It all felt hollow. The board of Holloway Enterprises had wasted no time appointing him as CEO. His name was everywhere, headlines, magazines. The face of a new era for the company. The prodigal son who had toppled a tyrant. And yet, Nathan didn't feel victorious. He felt like something vital had been ripped away from him, or rather someone. Every morning, he woke up expecting to hear the faint sound of movement from another room. He half expected to see a flash of red hair or hear a sarcastic remark waiting to cut through the silence. But Maggie was gone, and no amount of power or success could fill the void she had left behind. For years, Nathan had been consumed by his need for revenge, by his desire to prove himself to Richard, to win at any cost. But now that the battle was over, he realized he had lost the one thing that truly mattered. Maggie tried to convince herself she had made the right choice. She had spent so long running, so long surviving, that leaving Nathan felt like the only logical step. Now, standing in a small apartment in a city where no one knew her name, She felt like a stranger in her own life. She had done it. She had taken down Richard, reclaimed her story, and regained control. So why did it feel like she had left part of herself behind? The news updates were impossible to avoid. They were everywhere, a constant reminder of the life she had walked away from. Nathan Holloway was everywhere, on headlines, magazine covers, and business news channels. Nathan Holloway, CEO and the new face of Holloway Enterprises. Every time Maggie saw his name, a knot formed in her chest. She had walked away from him, telling herself it was for the best. Nathan belonged to a world she could never truly be part of. But deep down, Maggie knew the real reason. She hadn't left because of him. She had left because of herself. She was afraid. Afraid of what he made her feel. Afraid that if she stayed, she might let herself be loved. And that was something she had never allowed before. Nathan buried himself in work, hoping it would numb the ache in his chest. But it didn't. The boardroom felt stifling, the endless meetings empty, and the power plays pointless. No matter how many deals he closed or how much his net worth grew, it didn't change one undeniable fact. He missed her. He missed Maggie. Nathan had never been the type of man to dwell on a loss. He wasn't the kind to sit back and mourn what was gone. But Maggie wasn't just anyone. She had changed him. She had made him see the world and himself differently. Without her, Nathan felt like he was losing his way. Maggie tried to move on, but the ache in her chest didn't go away. She had started over before. She could do it again. But this time, it didn't feel like a fresh start. It felt like punishment. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Nathan. She saw the way he looked at her when she walked away, the way he told her he loved her, and how she hadn't said it back. She had convinced herself that leaving was the only way to protect herself. But now, standing alone, she couldn't help but wonder, had she made a mistake? Nathan knew he couldn't keep living like this. He had always been a man of action, someone who made things happen. His whole life, he had taken what he wanted, fought for it, and bent the world to his will. But with Maggie, he had done nothing. He had let her walk away, and that was his biggest regret. Standing in his office, gripping the edge of his desk, Nathan took a sharp breath. No more. Maggie might think this was over, but it wasn't. Not for him. She couldn't just vanish and expect him to move on. If she thought she could erase herself from his life, she was wrong. Nathan Holloway didn't give up on what mattered to him, and Maggie was the only thing that truly mattered now. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing power. He was chasing her. Nathan had always been relentless when he wanted something. If someone got in his way, he removed them. That's how he had built his career, how he had survived under Richard Holloway's rule, and how he had achieved victories no one thought possible. But Maggie wasn't a victory to claim. She wasn't a business deal, a rival to outmaneuver, or a conquest. She was Maggie, and that made her different from anything else in his life. Nathan didn't want her out of ambition or revenge. He wanted her simply because she was her. And this time, he wasn't letting her go. It took him months to find her. Maggie knew how to disappear. She had perfected it. She changed locations, stayed off the grid, and avoided anything that could tie her to her old life. But Nathan had resources, and more importantly, he had determination. Most leads turned into dead ends, until one didn't. A small town on the West Coast, a quiet street with a tucked-away bookstore, and a red-haired woman who had arrived a few months ago, working behind the counter and keeping to herself. The moment Nathan got the confirmation, he didn't hesitate. He booked the next flight. Maggie had convinced herself she had moved on. The past,